My name is Aurora. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions were made quietly, sometimes without ever acknowledging who made them possible. If you asked my colleagues to describe me, they'd probably say I was dependable, calm, low maintenance, the kind of person who didn't make noise unless something was truly broken. Some might even say I was lucky to have stability, a respectable title, and a seat in meetings where important things happened. What they wouldn't say is that I was underestimated. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to be convenient. I was the one who stayed composed when conversations turned sharp. The one who absorbed tension so others could stay comfortable. I didn't interrupt. I didn't posture. I didn't fight for airtime. And over time, that quiet presence became something else in their eyes, something smaller. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or winning arguments. There's no shouting, no dramatic exits, no last-minute heroics. What happened unfolded slowly, in conference rooms and follow-up emails, in pauses that lingered a second too long. It's about a single word spoken in a meeting, a word that revealed more than it was meant to, and about the moment I realized that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be more final than confrontation. You may recognize parts of yourself in this story, especially if you've ever been the reliable one. The person who holds systems together while remaining unseen. The one who tells themselves that professionalism means endurance. I want to be clear about something up front. I'm not telling this because I won. I'm telling it because I chose something irreversible and lived with the consequences calmly, without spectacle. What you'll hear is the emotional journey of restraint turning into clarity, of dignity being tested, not shattered, of power that never needed to announce itself to be real. This is also a story about timing, about preparation that looks like patience from the outside, and about what happens when someone mistakes composure for permission. I'll walk you through who I was to them, how the small cuts accumulated, and why the coldest response I ever gave involved no raised voice at all, only a document I had signed long before anyone thought I would need it. I'm sharing this honestly, without embellishment, not to instruct, but to document. Because sometimes the most meaningful turning points don't come with applause. They come with a quiet decision made while everyone else is still talking. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt the exact moment when respect slipped, even though no one else noticed? To them, I was reliable in the way furniture is reliable. Always there, rarely acknowledged. I didn't arrive at the company invisibly. That happened gradually, the way sound fades when a room gets used to it. In my first year, I spoke more. I offered ideas carefully, backing them with data, anticipating objections. People nodded. Sometimes they took notes. Occasionally, someone senior repeated my point 5 minutes later, and the room treated it like a revelation. I noticed. I said nothing. Over time, my role solidified. Not on paper, but in expectation. I became the one who handled things. The one looped in late because Aurora will catch up fast. The one trusted with complex transitions but excluded from the credit when they succeeded. If a project was failing quietly, it landed on my desk. If a process needed stabilizing, I was asked to take a look. If a meeting needed calm, I was invited, not to lead, but to absorb. No one ever said I was insignificant. That's the thing, they didn't need to. Significance erodes just fine without language. In meetings, I was listened to politely, the way you listen to someone you assume will be reasonable. When I disagreed, it was framed as concern, not conviction. When I insisted, it was labeled intensity. When I stayed silent, it was interpreted as agreement. I learned quickly what version of me made rooms comfortable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I waited for pauses. And in doing so, I trained people, unintentionally, to believe my contributions were optional, helpful but not essential, replaceable in theory, even if not in practice. My boss at the time liked to call me low drama. He meant it as a compliment. It was his way of saying I didn't make his job harder. I didn't challenge him publicly. I didn't ask for recognition in front of others. I didn't force him to choose sides. What he didn't see, or didn't care to see, was that low drama often comes at a cost. It comes from people who process things internally, who resolve tension privately, who keep track even when they don't react. In performance reviews, my feedback was consistent, dependable, steady, trusted, never visible, never critical, never indispensable, at least not out loud. And I accepted that framing longer than I should have, because it came wrapped in praise. Because there's a certain pride in being the person others lean on. Because when you're calm by nature, it's easy to confuse restraint with self-erasure. Outside of work, people didn't see me that way. Friends came to me for clarity, not comfort. They trusted my judgment. They knew I noticed things others missed. But at work, I learned to compartmentalize that part of myself. I told myself professionalism meant neutrality, that effectiveness didn't require recognition. I became very good at being underestimated, not in a dramatic way, in a subtle administrative way. The kind that shows up in who gets asked to present versus who gets asked to prepare the slides. In terms of who gets credited with outcomes versus who gets thanked privately afterward. I watched newer hires assert half-formed ideas and receive immediate validation. I watched my own suggestions gain weight only after being filtered through louder voices. And still, I stayed measured, observant, present, because I believed naively that consistency would speak for itself. What I didn't realize then was that silence doesn't just protect you, it defines you. And once people decide who you are to them, they rarely question it, unless something disrupts the pattern. At that stage of the story, nothing had been disrupted yet. I was useful, I was calm, I was trusted, and I was already being misread. The first moment didn't arrive with impact. It slipped in quietly, almost politely, which is why it took me a while to name it. We were in a midweek planning meeting, one of those recurring ones where decisions rarely happened, but the tone was set. 8 people around the table, coffee cooling, laptops half open. My manager was walking us through revised timelines, speaking quickly, already a little irritated by constraints he hadn't planned for. I had spent the previous weekend reviewing the dependencies he was glossing over, not because I was asked to, but because I knew where things would break. When there was a pause, I spoke, calmly, briefly. I pointed out a risk in the handoff between 2 teams, something that wouldn't surface immediately, but would cost weeks later. He didn't look at me at first. He kept his eyes on the screen and said, "Let's not overcomplicate it." The room moved on. No one reacted. No one glanced my way. It wasn't dismissal in the dramatic sense. It was efficient dismissal, the kind that keeps meetings on schedule. I told myself it was nothing. Managers get defensive about plans. Time was tight. Maybe he'd circle back. He didn't. 2 weeks later, the issue I'd mentioned surfaced exactly as predicted. The delay was discussed in another meeting, framed as unexpected. This time, my manager explained the problem himself, using almost the same language I had used earlier. Heads nodded, notes were taken, action items were assigned. No one connected the dots. After the meeting, he stopped by my desk. He said, "Good catch on that dependency. Wish we'd flagged it earlier." I smiled. I said, "Me too." That was the first small cut. Not because my idea was ignored, that happens, but because something shifted in how it was absorbed. My input was acceptable only when it could be detached from me, useful when it arrived without attribution, safe when it didn't require acknowledgement. I started noticing patterns after that. When I sent detailed notes ahead of meetings, they were skimmed. When I summarized them verbally, they were considered optional. But when I sent the same points privately to my manager, they resurfaced later as collective insights. Again, no malice, just momentum. I began to understand that I had been assigned a role I hadn't agreed to, the background processor, the person who refined thinking behind the scenes so others could present it cleanly. And still, I stayed quiet about it, because calling it out would have required friction, and I wasn't ready to be seen as difficult. There was another moment, smaller still, but sharper. We were reviewing quarterly outcomes. A senior colleague praised the team for leaning on available resources during a challenging sprint. Then he laughed lightly and said, "Some of us were basically feeding off Aurora's bandwidth." It was said as a joke. The room laughed softly. I did too, out of reflex. But the word lingered, feeding off. It wasn't meant to insult, but it revealed something unspoken, that my capacity was viewed as communal property, that my effort was expected, not respected, that my calm made it easy to forget there was a boundary. No one apologized. There was nothing to apologize for. Humor has plausible deniability. I went home that evening and replayed the meeting, not with anger, but with precision. I wasn't hurt. I was alerted, because the first sign of disrespect isn't cruelty. It's familiarity without care. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. On the surface, nothing changed. I continued to deliver, continued to support, continued to show up prepared. But internally, I began to log things. Not emotionally, structurally. Who spoke over whom? who redirected credit, who joked, and who paid for it. The first small cut didn't bleed. It marked a boundary I hadn't drawn yet. And the dangerous thing about undrawn boundaries is that people will keep walking until something stops them. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It acclimates you first. After that early moment, nothing overt happened. No insults, no raised voices, just a steady pattern of being minimized in ways small enough to dismiss individually and easy to excuse collectively. That's how normalization works. One instance is nothing. Two is a coincidence. By the time it becomes a pattern, you've already adjusted your expectations. I told myself I was being pragmatic. When my suggestions were bypassed in meetings, I assumed time constraints. When my name was missing from summaries, I assumed oversight. When decisions I'd influenced were attributed vaguely to the team, I reminded myself that collaboration was the goal. There was always a reasonable explanation available, and I accepted every one of them. I also noticed how people spoke around me rather than to me. Questions about projects I owned were directed at others first. Clarifications were requested in group chats without tagging me, even when I was the source of the information. When I stepped in to answer, responses were polite, but slightly surprised, as if I'd spoken out of turn. I adjusted. I waited longer before speaking. I prefaced more. I softened language that was already careful. I learned to phrase certainty as suggestion, foresight as concern. And the quieter I became, the more my role solidified. My manager began using me as a stabilizer. When conflict brewed between teams, I was asked to sit in and keep things constructive. When timelines slipped, I was tasked with reworking plans to make them viable again, often without additional authority to enforce them. I was trusted with responsibility, but not with influence. That distinction matters. Responsibility drains you. Influence protects you. At some point, someone new joined the team, a confident speaker, quick to assert opinions. In meetings, he interrupted freely. He challenged ideas half-formed. He was praised for initiative. Once after he cut me off mid-sentence, my manager said, smiling, "Let's hear him out first." I didn't object. I finished my thought later, after the momentum had passed. After the meeting, a colleague told me, "You're so patient, I don't know how you do it." It wasn't admiration, it was relief. My patience made things easier for everyone else. There was a particular phrase that started showing up in feedback. Aurora will adapt. It was meant to signal flexibility. What it really meant was expectation without consent. Deadlines moved? Aurora will adapt. Scope expanded? Aurora will adapt. Decisions reversed? Aurora will adapt. And I did. Not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed adaptation was a strength. Because I believed that showing irritation would undermine my credibility. Because I still thought, on some level, that composure would eventually be rewarded. I was wrong. The more I normalized these dynamics internally, the more they hardened externally. People don't question arrangements that work for them. There were moments, brief, sharp ones, where I felt something close to anger. Not explosive, just clarifying. A quiet sense that something was off. But each time, I reasoned my way out of it. It's not personal. This is just how things work. Pick your battles. So I picked none. What I didn't see then was that by staying reasonable in an unreasonable pattern, I was teaching others how to treat me. Disrespect doesn't always come from contempt. Sometimes it comes from comfort, from knowing someone won't push back, from trusting that they'll absorb impact without complaint. And I was very good at absorbing. I remember one evening staying late to resolve an issue caused by a decision I hadn't agreed with. The office was nearly empty, the lights dimmed automatically. I sent the final update and closed my laptop. In that quiet, something landed, not a thought, a realization. I had become essential and expendable at the same time. Essential to outcomes, expendable in recognition. That contradiction doesn't resolve itself. It demands a response, eventually. At that stage, though, I wasn't ready to respond. I was still explaining things away, still believing that endurance was noble, still hoping that consistency would recalibrate perception. I hadn't yet understood that silence, when sustained too long, stops being strategic. It becomes a signal. And signals are always read, whether you intend them to be or not. I didn't realize I'd been assigned a role until I noticed how uncomfortable people became when I stepped outside it. The role was never written down, it didn't appear in my job description, but everyone seemed to understand it instinctively. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the person who would handle it, not the one who would challenge, not the one who would escalate, certainly not the one who would disrupt. Once during a planning session, I pushed back. gently, on a timeline that was clearly unrealistic. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse. I simply stated that the dependencies hadn't been resolved and that committing publicly would create downstream issues. The room went quiet, not thoughtful quiet, awkward quiet. My manager cleared his throat and said, "Let's stay solution-oriented." It wasn't a rebuke exactly, but it repositioned me, subtly, as the problem, as the source of friction. After the meeting, someone joked, "That was spicy for you." I smiled, but something tightened. That's when I understood. My value, in their eyes, was conditional. I was respected as long as I played my part. Calm, accommodating, invisible when necessary. The role I'd been given was containment. I absorbed pressure so it didn't spill elsewhere. I translated chaos into order. I softened hard truths so they landed without consequence. And in doing so, I became a buffer, not a voice. Buffers are appreciated until they stop buffering. I noticed how language shifted around me. When I spoke with conviction, it was reframed as concern. When I set limits, they were treated as preferences. When I declined additional work, it was met with surprise, as if refusal wasn't in my vocabulary. Once, when I said I didn't have the capacity for a last-minute request, my manager said, half joking, "Come on, you always find a way." That sentence stayed with me, because it revealed an assumption that my boundaries were flexible by default, that my time was elastic, that my restraint was a resource to be used. I had trained them, unintentionally, to believe that I would adapt indefinitely. There's a particular loneliness in being seen as endlessly capable. It leaves no room for humanity, no space for error, no allowance for dignity. I wasn't angry, I was precise. I began to see how the system relied on people like me to function smoothly, while elevating those who disrupted loudly. How reliability was rewarded with more responsibility, but not more power. How calmness was confused with consent. And I saw clearly how stepping out of my assigned role would require a cost. The question was whether I was willing to pay it. At that point, I still wasn't, not fully. I told myself that influence could be built quietly, that respect would follow consistency, that timing mattered, but something had shifted. I stopped trying to correct perceptions. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped softening language that didn't need softening. Outwardly, nothing dramatic changed. I still delivered, still attended, still contributed. But internally, I began to detach from the role I'd been performing. I no longer took pride in being the one who made things easier for everyone else. I started asking a different question, one I'd avoided before. What happens if I stop holding this together? Not out of spite, out of truth, because roles persist only as long as someone agrees to play them. And for the first time, I was considering what it would mean to step away, not loudly, not impulsively, but deliberately. I didn't announce anything, I didn't warn anyone. I simply noticed. And noticing, it turns out, is the beginning of every real shift. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no dramatic exchange. Just a moment so ordinary that it would have disappeared entirely if I hadn't been paying attention. It was a Monday morning meeting, status updates, familiar faces, predictable rhythm. I had already spoken twice, both times concisely, both times acknowledged with polite nods and immediate redirection. Nothing unusual. Then my manager leaned back in his chair, scanning the room with the casual authority of someone who believed he was among allies. He was explaining a resource constraint, framing it as unavoidable, when he gestured vaguely in my direction and said, half smiling, "We'll make it work. Aurora's good at stretching. She doesn't mind picking up the slack." There it was. Not cruel, not angry, just assumed. The room chuckled softly. Someone added, "Yeah, she's a machine." A machine. I smiled reflexively, because that's what I'd trained myself to do. But something inside me went very still. In that pause, no more than a second, I saw the pattern in its entirety, not as a series of incidents, but as a system that functioned because I had made myself frictionless. I realized, with surprising calm, that my dignity had become negotiable, not because anyone had attacked it, but because I had allowed it to be treated as flexible. I didn't feel angry, I didn't feel embarrassed, I felt clear. For the rest of the meeting, I spoke only when necessary. My tone didn't change, my posture didn't change, but my internal orientation did. I stopped translating, I stopped compensating, I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. When someone asked a question that wasn't fully formed, I let the silence sit instead of rescuing it. When an assumption was made that relied on my unspoken labor, I didn't confirm it. No confrontation, just absence. After the meeting, my manager caught up with me in the hallway. He said lightly, "All good in there?" I looked at him and said, yes. And for the first time, I meant only that. That evening, I went home and didn't open my laptop. I didn't review notes. I didn't preemptively fix anything. Instead, I wrote a list, not of grievances, of facts. What I handled that no one tracked. What I knew that no one else documented. What depended on my memory, my relationships, my quiet interventions. The list was longer than I expected. Still, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sober. Because clarity brings responsibility. Once you see the shape of a situation, you can't unsee it. And you're accountable for what you do next. I slept well that night, deeply, without the low-grade tension I'd grown used to. In the days that followed, I maintained the shift. I didn't withdraw. I didn't disengage. I simply did my role as it was defined. No more, no less. And people noticed, not consciously at first, just small hesitations, slight delays, questions that lingered unanswered longer than usual. Someone asked, "Hey, have you looked at this yet?" I said, "It's not in my scope." The words felt strange, heavy, but also correct. There was no fallout, no accusation, just a pause, and then adjustment. That's when I understood something essential. Change doesn't require an announcement. It requires consistency. The day something shifted wasn't about them. It was about me reclaiming authorship over my own boundaries. I hadn't decided what I would do yet. I only knew what I would no longer do. And that was enough to begin. Once silence became a choice instead of a habit, everything about it changed. Before, my quiet had been automatic. A reflex shaped by years of conditioning. Be agreeable, be efficient, don't complicate things. Now it was deliberate, measured, applied. I still spoke in meetings, but only when the contribution was mine to own. I stopped finishing other people's thoughts, stopped preemptively clarifying decisions that hadn't been made yet, stopped volunteering context unless it was explicitly requested. What surprised me was how quickly my restraint was misinterpreted. People assumed I was busy, or tired, or disengaged. No one assumed I was being strategic. There were moments when discussions drifted into confusion. Exactly the kind I used to quietly resolve. This time, I watched. I took notes. I waited. Sometimes, someone would glance at me expecting rescue. I met their eyes calmly, offered nothing, and let the conversation continue. It wasn't punishment, it was accurate. I was still doing my job, just not everyone else's. My manager checked in more often, casual questions. "Everything okay?" "You seem quieter lately." I answered honestly but not expansively. "I'm focused." That seemed to satisfy him. The system adjusted to the absence of my excess labor, but awkwardly. Meetings ran longer. Follow-ups multiplied. Minor issues escalated because they weren't smoothed out early. And still, no one connected it to me. That's the strange thing about invisible work. Its absence is felt, but its source remains unnamed. I noticed a shift in how people spoke to me. Fewer assumptions, more direct requests, fewer jokes about my capacity. One afternoon, a colleague asked if I could just quickly handle something that clearly fell outside my role. I said, "I can't take that on." He paused, surprised, then said, "Okay, no problem." And that was it. No backlash, no resentment, just recalibration. I realized then how much of what I had feared was imagined. The cost of asserting boundaries had been inflated by years of internalized obligation. Silence, when chosen, has a weight. It makes people fill gaps they didn't know existed. It reveals dependencies without exposing you. And I used it carefully. I documented more. I summarized less verbally. I shifted communication to channels that created records instead of impressions. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was avoiding discomfort, but because confrontation would have returned me to the role of emotional manager, responsible for everyone's reactions. This was cleaner. I was watching patterns form. Who struggled when I didn't intervene? Who adapted quickly? Who became uneasy? I learned more about the organization in those weeks than I had in years of active participation. And I began to see something else. My value wasn't in being liked. It was in being precise. People mistook my calm for compliance before. Now they mistook my quiet for withdrawal. Both were incorrect. I wasn't pulling away. I was preparing. There was no rush, no urgency. I wasn't waiting for permission or validation. I was letting the system reveal itself fully, without my interference. Because once you understand where power actually flows, you don't need to announce your intentions. You just need to choose when to move. At this stage, no one felt threatened. No one felt challenged. They simply felt slightly less comfortable. And discomfort, when it arrives without drama, has a way of sharpening attention. I stayed patient. The time for action hadn't come yet, but it was getting closer. While everyone adjusted to my quieter presence, I began doing the most important work I'd done in years, and no one noticed. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. I still arrived on time, still attended meetings, still delivered what was formally required. My calendar didn't suddenly empty, my tone didn't harden, I didn't become distant or defensive. That was the point. What changed wasn't my visibility, it was my attention. I started paying close attention to how information moved, or didn't. Which decisions relied on institutional memory rather than documentation? Which relationships existed only because I maintained them? Which processes worked smoothly only because someone remembered to nudge, remind, translate, or absorb friction? I stopped assuming redundancy existed where it hadn't been explicitly built. I reviewed old handover notes and realized how much had never been written down. Context lived in conversations, not systems. Dependencies were managed by trust, not structure. And much of that trust pointed quietly to me. I began documenting everything. Not in a dramatic way, not as evidence for confrontation, but as a private act of clarity. I mapped workflows, noted where approvals stalled, tracked how long issues took to surface when I didn't intervene early. I saved emails, archived decisions, preserved timelines. I learned who relied on my judgment without realizing it, who deferred to my assessments informally, who forwarded questions my way instead of answering them themselves. At the same time, I observed leadership patterns, who spoke confidently without preparation, who leaned on summaries instead of substance, who avoided accountability by dispersing it. This wasn't about blame, it was about understanding leverage. Leverage isn't force, it's position. And position is often invisible until it's empty. I also began quiet conversations, careful ones, no complaints, just curiosity. When someone asked for context, I provided it and noted the dependency. When someone made a decision that affected my domain, I asked for clarity in writing. When the scope expanded, I confirmed boundaries explicitly. Each interaction left a trail, not for anyone else, for me. The more I documented, the calmer I became. Because calm comes from knowing where you stand. I also reviewed my own assumptions. I had believed for years that my value lay in continuity, that leaving would be disruptive, even harmful. That belief had kept me cautious. Now I examined it honestly. The organization didn't reward continuity, it consumed it. If I stayed, nothing structural would change. My silence would be interpreted as endurance, my boundaries as flexibility. And if I left without preparation, the narrative would be simple. She moved on. I wasn't interested in narratives. I was interested in truth. Quietly, methodically, I began preparing for a decision I hadn't named yet. I reviewed my contract, my notice period, my non-compete clauses. I consulted an attorney, not to threaten, but to understand my rights clearly. I updated my resume, not because I planned to send it, but because I wanted to see my work on paper, stripped of context. It was substantial, more than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. I also drafted something else, a resignation letter, not emotional, not accusatory, professional, precise. And I signed it, not to use immediately, but to remove hesitation from the future. The act of signing wasn't dramatic, it was grounding. It turned a hypothetical into an option. I placed the letter in a slim black folder and put it in my desk drawer. No one knew. Weeks passed. The system continued to strain in small ways. Leadership attributed it to the workload, to market pressure, to growing pains. No one thought to look at the quiet space I had stopped filling. That's the paradox of invisible labor. When it's gone, people blame the weather. I felt no rush, no need to announce readiness. Preparation, when done properly, doesn't feel tense. It feels inevitable. By the time anyone sensed something was off, I was already clear. I knew what I held. I knew what they assumed. And I knew exactly what would happen if I chose to let go. They never noticed the moment the balance shifted. But it had, and it wasn't shifting back. The private reveal didn't come as a shock. It arrived the way truth often does, quietly, when you finally stop rushing past it. I was reviewing a set of transition documents late one afternoon, cross-referencing timelines that had never quite aligned. On the surface, everything looked functional. Projects moved forward. Deadlines were being met. But beneath that, the structure was fragile in a very specific way. Too many decisions depended on unwritten context I held. I saw it clearly then, not as ego, but as architecture. If I stepped away, nothing would collapse immediately. Systems like that never do. They wobble first. They hesitate. They misfire in places no one expects. And eventually, they reveal what was holding them together. The realization wasn't empowering in the cinematic sense. There was no surge of triumph, just a settling. This wasn't about being irreplaceable. No one is. It was about being unacknowledged while being central, about carrying weight without authority, about being trusted implicitly while being spoken of lightly. I finally understood the leverage I had, not because I was special, but because the organization had built convenience around my restraint. That was the reveal. Not that I could hurt them, that I could leave cleanly, and leaving cleanly, when done at the wrong moment, is far more disruptive than any confrontation. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time. I asked myself the hard questions, the ones I had avoided when staying quiet felt easier. If I stayed, would anything change? If I spoke up, would it be heard or reframed? If I left, would I regret not having said more? The answer that came back was steady. I had already said enough, just not out loud. My documentation told the story. My preparation told the truth. My signed letter told me I was no longer trapped by indecision. That night, I took the folder out of my desk and brought it home. I placed it on my dining table, not to open it, but to acknowledge it. I didn't feel defiant. I felt respectful to myself. There's a difference between reacting and deciding. I had crossed into decision territory. Over the next few days, I paid attention to how people interacted with me. My manager delegated without checking assumptions. Colleagues referenced my availability as a given. A senior leader joked in passing, "We'd be lost without you," and moved on without pausing to consider what that actually meant. No one asked how I was experiencing the work. No one noticed the stillness. That too was information. The reveal wasn't about power over them. It was about power over myself. I realized that dignity doesn't demand acknowledgement from those who benefit from its absence. It requires alignment between what you tolerate and what you value. I valued precision, integrity, choice, and I had reached the edge of tolerance. The final confirmation came in a small moment. I was asked casually to cover for a decision that had been made without my input, to help explain it to another team, to soften the impact. I listened, I nodded. Then I said, "That wouldn't be appropriate for me to do." There was a pause, a recalibration. "Oh, okay," my manager said. "We'll figure something else out." No apology, no reflection. And that was it. I didn't need more data. The reveal was complete. I wasn't staying because I was valued. I was staying because I was useful. Usefulness without respect is not stability, it's extraction. Once you see that clearly, there's no urgency, no anger, just a timeline. I knew then that the next step wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be reactive. It would be final. Every story like this has a moment people expect to be dramatic. This wasn't it. The decision point didn't come with a raised voice or a sleepless night. It arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, in the space between meetings, when my calendar showed a rare 30-minute gap. I sat at my desk and reviewed my options, not emotionally, but structurally. I could stay and recalibrate expectations. That would require explicit conversations, careful framing, and a willingness to manage others' discomfort. Even if successful, it would take months, and the cost would be constant vigilance. I could confront the pattern directly, name the disrespect, ask for recognition. That path assumed good faith and readiness to change, neither of which had been demonstrated. More importantly, it would return me to the role of emotional translator, responsible not just for my work, but for repairing the system that diminished it. Or I could choose the option that required no permission. I could leave, not impulsively, not angrily, but precisely. I thought about what each option demanded of me. Staying requires hope. Confrontation required energy. Leaving required clarity. I already had clarity. I opened the black folder in my drawer and took out the resignation letter. I read it once. It was concise, neutral. It stated my intent, my timeline, and my commitment to a smooth transition. No accusations, no explanations. That absence was deliberate. I signed it weeks earlier, but this time the signature felt different. It felt active. Still, I didn't submit it yet. I wanted to be certain that I wasn't reacting to a moment, so I waited. I watched one more meeting, one more interaction. That meeting happened the next morning. It was a cross-functional review, high visibility, senior leadership present. My manager was tense, aware of scrutiny. As the discussion moved to a bottleneck I knew well, he gestured toward me and said lightly, "Aurora's been kind of living off the team lately, but she'll help clean this up." The word hung there, living off. It was said with a smile, framed as humor, but this time no one laughed. I felt no heat rise, no urge to defend myself. Instead, I felt confirmation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a worldview. I didn't respond. I didn't correct him. I made a note. After the meeting, I returned to my desk, closed my email, and opened the resignation letter. I added the date. That was the decision point. Not the insult, not the pattern, The choice to stop explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was to them. I submitted the letter to HR and copied my manager. Standard process, no commentary. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk. Outside, the city moved as it always did. People hurried, coffee cups steamed. Nothing acknowledged what had just shifted. And that's how I knew the decision was right. Decisions made from alignment don't need validation. By the time I returned, there was a message from my manager asking if we could talk. I replied that I was available later in the day. Calm, polite, unchanged. I wasn't ending a chapter in anger. I was closing a loop. What came next would unfold without my intervention. And that finally felt honest. Once the letter was submitted, everything became very quiet. Not externally. People still talked. Meetings still happened. Calendars remained full. But the internal noise, the constant calculation, the background vigilance, fell away. I didn't announce my resignation. HR acknowledged it. My manager scheduled a conversation. That was all. Until then, I moved exactly as I had before. That's the mistake people make when they expect departure to look dramatic. They assume something will change immediately. Those emotions will spill. That productivity will drop. None of that happened. I continued to document, continued to respond professionally, continued to do only what my role required. No less, no more. The difference was that now, everything I did had an end date. And that knowledge brought precision. In meetings, I spoke clearly and briefly. I stopped framing suggestions as hypotheticals. I stated facts. When decisions were flawed, I noted risks without cushioning them. When I was asked to absorb impact, I redirected it to its source. No pushback, no defensiveness, just clean boundaries. My manager finally called me into his office. He closed the door and asked, "Is this about something specific?" I looked at him and said, "No, it's about alignment." He waited for more. I didn't offer it. There's a particular power in not filling silence when you no longer need to convince anyone. He shifted in his chair, asked if there was anything that could change my mind. I said no. That was the entire conversation. What followed was a slow realization on their part. Though no one named it yet, questions started coming in more frequently. Do you have documentation for this? Can you walk us through how you usually handle that? Where is the context for this decision stored? I provided what existed. I didn't create what I never had. I didn't hoard information. I transferred it responsibly. But I didn't reconstruct systems that had never been formalized. Silence again did its work. Leadership began to notice friction. Tasks took longer. Clarifications multiplied. Small issues escalated because they weren't being quietly resolved in advance. No one accused me. There was nothing to accuse. I was fulfilling my obligations. And that's the part people misunderstand. Moving in silence isn't about withholding. It's about refusing to compensate. I also noticed how the tone shifted. The jokes stopped. The assumptions softened. People checked before committing my time. My manager became careful with language. Respect arrived, not as recognition but as caution. Too late. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't pleased. I was steady. During that period, I prepared financially, reviewed benefits, confirmed final dates, ensured my exit would be clean. I didn't line up another job immediately. That wasn't the point. I wanted space, not escape. Every day, I left the office on time. Every day, I slept well. And still, no one grasped the full shape of what was happening. They assumed this was the standard transition, that things would stabilize once responsibilities were redistributed. They didn't yet understand how much had been absorbed rather than assigned. That realization would come later. For now, I moved quietly, because silence, when paired with inevitability, doesn't need to announce itself. It just waits. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. At first, it showed up as an inconvenience. A meeting had to be rescheduled because the right context wasn't available. A decision was stalled because no one was certain who owned it. A minor issue escalated because it hadn't been flagged early enough. People shrugged it off. Transition period, they said. Growing pains. I watched from within the process, still present, still professional, but no longer cushioning the impact. Requests started landing in my inbox with new urgency. Can you just take a quick look at this? Do you remember how we handled something similar last year? Where did we document that exception? I responded when appropriate. I pointed to existing documents. I clarified what was already written down. When something lived only in memory, I said, "I don't believe that was documented." That sentence became uncomfortable because it revealed how much of the organization relied on informal knowledge and how little had been formalized despite years of opportunity. Meetings grew tense. My manager began to feel the pressure first. Questions that used to bypass him now stopped at his desk. Senior leaders wanted explanations for delays that had never existed before. He called me again. This time there was less casualness. Is there anything you can do to help smooth this out before you leave? I said, I'm doing everything outlined in my role and transition plan. It was true. He nodded, but his jaw tightened. The system was asking more of him now, and he wasn't used to carrying that weight. Colleagues became uncertain. Some reached out quietly, asking if I was really leaving. Others assumed I'd be convinced to stay. A few expressed surprise. We didn't know you were unhappy. I answered honestly. I wasn't unhappy. I was misaligned. That distinction confused them. Because unhappiness invites fixing, misalignment requires change. And change is harder. I noticed something else too. People began to speak more carefully around me. They no longer joked about my capacity. They no longer assumed my agreement. The respect I had waited for arrived only after my departure was inevitable. That's not irony. It's a pattern. Respect that appears under threat isn't respect. It's the fear of loss. I didn't resent it. I noted it. As deadlines approached, leadership attempted to redistribute responsibilities, but without full context, tasks were assigned inefficiently, work duplicated. Gaps emerged. No catastrophe, just erosion, the kind that's hard to explain to stakeholders. And still, no one named the cause. They spoke about workload, about bandwidth, about needing to tighten processes. They didn't speak about the cost of assuming someone would always adapt. One afternoon, I overheard my manager on a call, voice low, explaining a delay. He said, "We're in a bit of a knowledge transition." The phrase was careful, impersonal. It removed agency from the situation. But transitions don't happen in a vacuum. They are responses to choices. I had made mine. As my final weeks approached, the atmosphere changed. People became polite in a different way. Invitations arrived with disclaimers. Appreciation was expressed retroactively. Did we ever thank you for... I didn't realize you were handling all of that. I listened, I nodded. Acknowledgement, once delayed too long, doesn't land the way people expect. It doesn't heal, it doesn't repair. It simply marks that something has already been lost. And the loss was no longer theoretical. They were feeling it now without knowing exactly where it came from. That's how consequences begin. Quietly, logically, without accusation. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like politeness sharpened by urgency. By the time my final 2 weeks began, the organization had moved from inconvenience to concern. Meetings were called with less notice. Leaders who had never asked for my input directly now requested quick syncs. Language shifted from assumption to inquiry, from certainty to contingency. Still, no one said the obvious thing. No one said, "We didn't realize how much depended on you." Instead, they circled it. My manager became visibly strained. He asked more questions than he answered. He checked the documents twice. He followed up where he never used to. One afternoon, he sat across from me in a conference room and said, "I'm trying to understand how we got here." I believed him, but understanding at that stage wouldn't change the outcome. He asked if I'd consider extending my notice period. Just a few weeks, just to help stabilize things. I declined, not coldly, not defensively. "I've planned my transition carefully," I said. Extending it wouldn't solve the underlying issue. He didn't argue. He looked tired. That's when I knew it was too late, not because they didn't care, but because they were responding to symptoms, not causes. Senior leadership got involved. There were conversations about restructuring, about redefining roles, about investing in documentation and process. All good ideas, all arriving after the person who had been quietly holding those systems together had already chosen to step away. I was invited to a meeting with 2 directors. They thanked me for my contributions. They asked what might have made me stay. I answered honestly, but selectively. I needed my role to reflect the responsibility I carried, I said. And I needed respect to be proactive, not reactive. There was a pause. Notes were taken. One of them said, "We wish we'd known sooner." I didn't say what came to mind, that I had known for a long time. Instead, I said, "I made the best decision with the information available to me," which was true. The organization was now trying to retrofit dignity into a structure that had been built on quiet endurance. It doesn't work that way. You can't backfill respect after it's been deferred for too long. You can't ask someone to trust a system they've already outgrown. The attempts to fix things became more visible. My calendar is filled with requests to explain not just what I did, but how I thought. People wanted frameworks, heuristics, judgment calls. I gave what I could, but judgment isn't transferable in a meeting. It's built through authority and acknowledgement over time. And time was the one thing they no longer had. I watched people try to step into pieces of my role. Capable people, smart people. They struggled, not because they weren't good, but because the role had never been defined properly. It had been shaped around me, informally, without consent. That realization brought a kind of quiet regret into the room. Not guilt, regret. And regret is heavy because it recognizes loss without offering a remedy. On my last Friday, there was an attempt at closure. A small gathering, polite speeches, words like grateful and impact. I thanked them, I meant it. But inside, I felt no sense of resolution. Because closure isn't something others give you. It's something you create by leaving at the right moment. They were trying to fix what had already passed. And I was already gone, in every way that mattered. The confrontation everyone expected never really happened. There was no raised voice, no emotional accounting, no moment where I finally said everything. What did happen was smaller and more decisive. It took place 2 days before my last day. My manager asked if we could talk one more time, not officially, just a conversation. We sat in the same conference room where so many planning sessions had unfolded. The glass walls were familiar. The chairs are uncomfortable in the way all office chairs are when the conversation matters. He didn't start with an apology. He started with reflection. I've been thinking a lot about how we worked together, he said. And I'm wondering if there were things I missed. I let the silence hold for a moment before answering. There were, I said, but naming them now wouldn't change what's already in motion. He nodded slowly. That was the moment, our intent. I understood something important. Confrontation isn't about release. It's about timing. If I had said these things months earlier, they would have been received as concerns. Negotiable, manageable. Now they would only land as regret. He asked me what hurt the most. I considered the question carefully. It wasn't a single comment, I said. It was the assumption that my restraint meant permission, that my consistency meant consent. He winced, not theatrically, but genuinely. I never meant to disrespect you, he said. I know, I replied. Intent wasn't the issue. That seemed to surprise him. Disrespect doesn't require malice. It only requires inattention. I didn't list incidents. I didn't quote meetings. I didn't revisit language. Instead, I said one thing. When someone's dignity is challenged repeatedly in small ways, the response isn't always anger. Sometimes it's withdrawal, sometimes it's preparation. He leaned back, thought about that. I wish you'd told me, he said. I was telling you, I answered, just not in a way that demanded immediate reaction. That was as close as we came to confrontation. There was no defense after that, no justification, just understanding arriving too late to be useful. He thanked me for my honesty, I thanked him for listening. And that was it. When I stood to leave, he said something quietly. I called you a leech once. I thought I was being funny. I turned back to him. I know, I said, but humor reveals assumptions. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. That was the coldest moment. Not because it was cruel, but because it was precise. Because dignity doesn't need volume to assert itself. I didn't forgive him in that room, not because I held a grudge, but because forgiveness isn't always necessary for closure. What I felt was neutrality. I walked out of the room without shaking his hand, not pointedly, just naturally. Later, as I packed my desk, I placed the black folder back into my bag. The resignation letter had already done its work. I didn't look back at the office when I left. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defined me. The confrontation had happened without heat, and it had been enough. After I left, people expected a reaction. Some kind of emotional aftermath, bitterness, relief, celebration, collapse. None of that happened. What came instead was a quiet recalibration. The first few weeks were intentionally unstructured. I didn't rush into anything new. I woke without an alarm. I let my days stretch without being optimized. And in that space, I noticed how much of myself I had compressed to fit a role that was never meant to hold me. I wasn't exhausted in the way people expect burnout to look. I was unburdened. There's a difference. Burnout feels like depletion. This felt like a release. I took long walks, read slowly, revisited interests that had nothing to do with productivity. I allowed myself to exist without translating my worth into output. And something subtle happened. My voice came back, not literally, internally. I noticed how I spoke to myself, with more authority, less negotiation. How I evaluated opportunities, not by prestige, but by alignment. I wasn't avoiding responsibility, I was refusing misplacement. When I eventually began conversations about next steps, I asked different questions than I used to. Who has decision-making power here? How is disagreement handled? What happens when someone sets a boundary? I listened carefully to the answers, not just the words, but the ease with which they were offered. I also noticed something else. The narrative others held about me no longer mattered. At my previous job, perception had been a slow erosion, shaped by proximity, repetition, and convenience. Now, outside of that system, it dissolved quickly. I wasn't low drama, I wasn't reliable, I wasn't the one who adapts. I was precise, I was selective, I was self-directed, and those qualities didn't need defending. I thought about the version of myself who had stayed quiet for so long. I didn't judge her. She had been strategic with the tools she had. She had believed in endurance because endurance had worked before. But I had outgrown that belief. There's a moment in adulthood when you realize that being capable isn't enough, that competence without dignity is a liability, that silence when unchosen can become a cage. I didn't become louder after leaving. I became clearer. I didn't seek validation for my decision. I didn't need the story to land a certain way for anyone else. The power wasn't in leaving, it was in choosing. Today, I still value calm, still prefer restraint to spectacle, still believe in doing work well, but I no longer confuse restraint with permission. If someone underestimates me now, it's temporary, because I no longer stay in places where underestimation is required for comfort. The cold response people remember, the resignation letter, the lack of argument, the absence of explanation, wasn't meant to teach anyone a lesson. It was simply the most honest thing I could do. Who I am now isn't defined by what I endured. It's defined by what I no longer accept. There's a lesson people often want from stories like this. They want a strategy, a script, a moment they can replay and imagine themselves delivering better lines. That isn't what this is. The moral of the story isn't about quitting, or standing up dramatically, or waiting for the perfect insult before you act. It's about attention, because long before dignity is openly violated, it is usually eroded, quietly, politely, through assumptions that go unchallenged because challenging them feels inconvenient. The most dangerous moments aren't the loud ones. They're the ones that teach you to adjust instead of questioning. I wasn't called a leech because someone hated me. I was called that because my restraint had made my labor feel ambient, available without acknowledgement, useful without weight. And the cold response people remember, the pre-signed resignation letter, the absence of argument, wasn't punishment. It was alignment. I didn't leave to prove a point. I left because staying would have required me to betray my own perception. And once you start doubting what you see, you lose something harder to recover than a job. What I learned is this: silence isn't weak, but unchosen silence is costly. Reliability isn't a virtue if it replaces respect. Calm isn't strength if it's mistaken for consent. And dignity doesn't demand applause. It requires consistency between what you tolerate and what you value. If you take anything from the story, let it be a question you ask yourself, not once but regularly. Am I staying because I'm respected, or because I'm convenient? The difference matters more than we like to admit. Sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect isn't explanation or confrontation. It's withdrawal, done cleanly, without spectacle, without bitterness. Not everyone will understand your choice. They don't have to. Your life isn't a courtroom. You don't owe a defense. Before we end, I want to ask you something, especially if you've ever been the dependable one, the quiet one, the person others lean on without noticing the cost. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that your silence was being mistaken for permission? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your experience in the comments.